here we are. Like, yeah, looking at the camera.
Good evening, or good morning, or afternoon.
Whenever you're picking this up.
Yeah, we wanted to come back and finish reading chapter 2. If you didn't catch chapter 1 and the first part of chapter 2 of The Hiding Place by Corrie Ten Boom, then make sure you read it or you go and listen to our first recording. We enjoyed ourselves and hope that anybody following along did. But tomorrow evening, Monday night, the 12th, we will be embarking into chapter 3 and just didn't want to overlook any of the parts or have to summarize. And so this is not required. We're going to keep reading.
We thought we'd post it so you wouldn't miss any.
Yeah. So for those of y'all that are picking back up right where we left off, we're in chapter 2, which is called it's called Full Table. We are sitting at a table. It's not full actually, but we're filling the space in the camera to make it look that way. So Corrie was remembering a time when she was young and was talking about her sisters and getting ready for school and the fuss over clothes, and she doesn't quite get that. So their aunt has given them a hat that they have to wear. They aren't excited about it, and one of the girls was given a really pretty hat that they're going to try to get by the aunt. And so that's what we left off. All right. Anything else, Rob? We're going for it. Okay. So Nolly had just said, Corrie, that wouldn't be honest. She's shocked that she would try to hide the hat within the other hat, the pretty one within the ugly one. And with a baleful glance at the big brown hat, she picked up the little fur one and started after Betsy round the stairs down to breakfast. That's where we're picking up. So I picked up my own hat, the despised gray one from last year, and trailed after them, one hand clinging to the center posts. Let Tante see the silly hat then. I didn't care. I never could understand all the fuss over clothes. What I did understand, what was awful and alarming, was that this was the day I was to start school. To leave this old house above the watch shop, leave Mama, Father, and the aunts. In fact, leave behind everything that was certain and well-loved. I gripped the post so tight that my palms squeaked as I circled around. The elementary school was only a block and a half away. It was true, and Nolly had gone there 2 years without difficulty. But Nolly was different from me. She was pretty and well-behaved and always had her handkerchief. And then as I rounded the final curve... And then as I rounded the final curve, the solution came to me so clear and simple that I laughed out loud. I just wouldn't go to school. I'd stay here and help Tante Anna with the cooking, and Mama would teach me to read, and I'd never go into that strange, ugly building at all. Relief and comfort flooded me, and I took the last 3 steps in a bound. Shh! Betsy and Nolly were waiting for me outside the dining room door. For heaven's sake, Corrie, don't do anything to get Tante Ann started wrong, Betsy said. I'm sure, she added doubtfully, that Father and Mama and Tante Anna will like Nolly's hat. Tante Beth won't, I said. She never likes anything, Nolly said, so she doesn't count. Tante Beth, with a perpetual, disapproving scowl, was the oldest of the aunts and the one we children liked least. You gotta love the honesty, right?
Of her looking back and saying that about it, right?
For 3 years, she had worked as a governess in wealthy families, and she continually compared our behavior with that of the young ladies and gentlemen she was used to. Betsy pointed to the Frisian clock on the stair wall, and with a finger on her lips, silently opened the dining room door. It was 8:12. Breakfast had already begun. 2 minutes late, cried Willem triumphantly. The Waller children were never late, said Tante Beth. But they're here, said Father, and the room is brighter. The 3 of us hardly heard. Tante Jan's chair was empty. Is Tante Jan staying in bed today? Asked Betsy hopefully as we hung our hats on their pegs. She's making herself a tonic in the kitchen, said Mama. She leaned forward to pour our coffee and lowered her voice.
To pour their coffee? She was like 6, 5 or 6. I love this. Yeah. Coffee for the 5 and 6-year-olds.
Says the pediatrician.
Yeah.
She leaned forward to pour our coffee and lowered her voice. We must all be specially considerate of dear Jan's today. This is the day her husband's sister died some years ago. Or was it his cousin? I thought it was his aunt, said Tatiana. It was a cousin and it was a mercy, said Tante Beth. At any rate, Mama hurried on. You know how these anniversaries upset dear Jan, so we must try to make it up to her. Betsy cut 3 slices from the round loaf of bread while I looked around the table trying to decide which adult would be the most enthusiastic about my decision to stay at home. Father, I knew, put an almost religious importance on education. He himself had had to stop school early to go to work in the watch shop, and though he had gone on to teach himself history, theology, and literature in 5 languages, he always regretted the missed schooling. He would want me to go, and whatever Father wanted, Mama would want me to go. Would want to. Tatiana then? She'd often told me she couldn't manage without me to run errands up and down the steep stairs. Since Mama was not strong, Tatiana did most of the heavy housework for our family of 9. She was the youngest of the 4 sisters with a spirit as generous as Mama's own. There was a myth in our family, firmly believed by all, that Tatiana received wages for this work, and indeed, every Saturday, Father faithfully paid her 1 guilder. But by Wednesday, when the greengrocer came, he often had to ask for it back, and she always had it, unspent and waiting. Yes, she would be my ally in this business. Tatiana, I began, I've been thinking about you working so hard all day when I'm in school, and a deep, dramatic intake of breath made us all look up. Tante Jans was standing in the kitchen doorway, a tumbler of thick brown liquid in her hand. When she had filled her chest with air, she closed her eyes, lifted the glass to her lips, and drained it down. Then with a sigh, she let out the breath, set the glass on the sideboard, and sat down. And yet, she said, as though we had been discussing the subject, what do doctors know? Dr. Blinker prescribed this tonic, but what can medicine really do? What good does anything do when one's day arrives?
Certainly some wisdom in that.
Yeah.
Of course, the medicine, it doesn't work unless it tastes like that.
Right.
It tastes terrible.
Brown.
I don't prescribe many tonics.
I glanced around the table. No one was smiling. Tante Jan's preoccupation with death might have been funny, but it wasn't. Young as I was, I knew that fear is never funny. And yet, Jan's father remonstrated gently, medicine has prolonged many a life. It didn't help Zuje, forgive me if I mispronounced that, to say it with confidence and move along.
Yeah, that's right.
And she had had the finest doctors in Rotterdam. It was this very day when she was taken, and she was no older than I am now, and got up and dressed for breakfast that day just as I have. She was launching into a minute-by-minute account of Zuje's day when her eyes lit on the peg from which dangled Nally's new hat. A fur muff, she demanded, each word bristling with suspicion. At this time of year? It isn't a muff, Tante Jan, said Nally in a small voice. And is it possible to learn what it is? It's a hat, Tante Jans, Betsy answered for her. A surprise from Mrs. Van Diver. Wasn't it nice of... Oh, no. Nally's hat has a brim, as a well-brought-up girl should. I know. I bought and paid for it myself. There were flames in Tante Jan's eyes, tears in Nally's when Mama came to the rescue. I'm not at all sure this cheese is fresh, she sniffed at the big pot of yellow cheese in the center of the table and pushed it across the father. God, a pot of cheese. That sounds great.
Yeah. That I also like. They kept the bread in a drawer.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we think of, oh no, how long has that bread been out? Yeah, the bread was in a drawer. The cheese was just in a pot on the table.
What do you think,
All these people
Casper?
lived to be like 80s.
I know, right? Father, who was incapable of practicing deceit or even recognizing it, took a long and earnest sniff. You should pick up here. You're good at the father's voice.
That's the only part you let me read.
Just that.
I'm sure it's perfectly fine, my dear. Fresh as the day it came. Mr. Steerwick's cheese is always... Catching Mama's look, he stared from her to Jan's in confusion. Oh, Jans, what do you think? Tante Jan seized the pot and glared into it with righteous zeal. If there was one subject which engaged her energies even more completely than modern clothing, it was spoiled food. I stand corrected. They had to have good smellers. At last, almost reluctantly it seemed to me, she approved of the cheese. But the hat was forgotten. She had plunged into the sad story of an acquaintance, my very age, who had died after eating a questionable fish. When the shop people arrived, and Father took down the heavy Bible from its shelf. There were only 2 employees in the watch shop in 1898. The clockman and the father's young apprentice errand boy. And they said this at the beginning of the chapter. This is 1898. The last chapter was in 1937. So this is part of that timeline that we can keep talking about of her memory of this wonderful time. And again, like God's pursuit of her. But when Mama had poured their coffee, Father put on his rimless spectacles and began to read. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. Thou art my hiding place and my shield. I hope in thy word. What kind of hiding place, I wondered idly as I watched Father's brown beard rise and fall with the words. What was there to hide from? It was a long, long song. Beside me, Nolly began to squirm. When at last Father closed the big volume, she, Willem, and Betsy were on their feet in an instant and snatched up their hats. Next minute, they had raced down the last 5 stairs and out the alley door. More slowly, the 2 shop workers got up and followed them down the stairs to the shop's rear entrance. Only then did the 5 adults notice me, still seated at the table. Corrie, cried Mama. Have you forgotten you're a big girl now? Today you go to school too. Hurry, or you must cross the street alone. I'm not going. There was a short, startled silence, broken by everybody at once. When I was a girl, Tante Jans began. Miss Weiler's children, from Tante Beth. But Father's deep voice drowned them out. Of course she's not going alone. Nolly was excited today and forgot to wait, that's all. Corrie is going with me. And with that, he took my hat from its peg, wrapped my hand in his, and led me from the room. My hand in Father's. That meant the windmill on the Sparn or the swans on the canal. But this time he was taking me where I didn't want to go. There was a railing along the bottom five steps. I grabbed it with my free hand and held on. Skilled watchmaker's fingers closed over mine and gently unwound them. Howling and struggling, I was led away from the world I knew into a bigger, stranger, harder one.
It's lovely as you read that. I think about the father.
Yeah.
And pulling her into something that's hard, but out of love. And
right.
His grip is not off of her. And I haven't quite heard it.
We'll chew on that more, with discussion groups and things. But clearly that is the beautiful part of Corrie looking back and seeing, all of this is making her preparation from the father so much more real. Like she's just, it's lovely. Mondays, Father took the train to Amsterdam to get the time from the Naval Observatory. Now that I had started school, it was only in the summer that I could go with him. I would race downstairs to the shop, scrubbed, buttoned, and pronounced passable by Betsy. Father would be giving last-minute instructions to the apprentice. Miss Stahl will be in the morning to pick up her watch. This clock goes to the baker's in Bloemendaal. And then we would be off to the station, hand in hand. I lengthening my strides, and he shortening his to keep in step. The train to Amsterdam took only half an hour, but it was a wonderful ride. First, the close wedged buildings of old Haarlem gave way to separate houses with little plots of land around them. The spaces between the houses grew wider, and then we were in the country, the flat Dutch farmland stretching to the horizon, ruler straight canals sweeping past the window, At last, Amsterdam, even bigger than Harlem, with its bewilderment of strange streets and canals. Father always arrived a couple of hours before the time signal in order to visit the wholesalers who supplied him with watches and parts. Many of these were Jews, and these were the visits we both liked best. After the briefest possible discussion of business, Father would draw a small Bible from his traveling case. The wholesaler, whose beard would be even longer and fuller than Father's, would snatch a book or a scroll out of a drawer, clap a prayer cap onto his head, and the two of them would be off, arguing, comparing, interrupting, contradicting, reveling in each other's company. And then, just when I had decided that this time I had really been forgotten, the wholesaler would look up, catch sight of me as though for the first time, and strike his forehead with the heel of his hand. A guest in my gates, and I have offered her no refreshment. And springing up, he would rummage under shelves and into cupboards, and before long, I would be holding on my lap a plate of the most delicious treats in the world. Honey cakes and date cakes, and a kind of confection of nuts, fruits, and sugar. Desserts were rare in the Bay. Sticky delights like these, unknown. This really is it's just a reminder of what community can look like, even amongst those who don't agree.
Yeah, they reveled in each other's company.
Yeah, just the delight of knowing that they both were made in the image of the Father. I mean, yeah, for us to be reminded of that. By 5 minutes before noon, we were always back at the train station, standing at a point on the platform from which we had a good view of the tower of the Naval Observatory. On the top of the tower, where it could be seen by all the ships in the harbor, was a tall shaft with two movable arms. At the stroke of 12 o'clock noon each day, the arms dropped. Father would stand at his vantage point on the platform, almost on tiptoe, with the joy of precision, holding his pocket watch and pad and a pencil. There! 4 seconds fast. Within an hour, the astronomical clock in the shop in Harlem would be accurate to the second. On the train trip home, we no longer gazed out the window. Instead, we talked about different things as the years passed. Betsy's graduation from secondary school, in spite of the months missed with illness. Whether Willem, when he graduated, would get the scholarship that would let him go to the university. Betsy starting work as Father's bookkeeper in the shop. Oftentimes, I would use the trip home to bring up things that were troubling me, since anything I asked at home was promptly answered by the aunts. Once, I must have been 10 or 11, I asked Father about a poem we had read at school the winter before. One line had described a young man whose face was not shadowed by sex sin. One word. I've never seen it written like that. I had been far too shy to ask the teacher what it meant, and Mama had blushed scarlet when I consulted her. In those days, just after the turn of the century, sex was never discussed, even at home. So the line had stuck in my head. Sex, I was pretty sure it meant whether you were a boy or a girl, and sin made Tante Ans very angry. But what the two together meant, I could not imagine. And so, seated next to Father, in the train compartment, I suddenly asked him, Father, what's sex sin? He turned to look at me, as he always did when answering a question. But to my surprise, he said nothing. At last, he stood up, lifted his traveler's case from the rack over our heads, and set it on the floor. Will you carry it off the train for me, Carrie? Corrie? Carry this, Corrie. I stood up and tugged at it. It was crammed with watches and spare parts he had purchased that morning. It's too heavy, I said. Yes, he said. And it would be a pretty poor father who would ask his little girl to carry such a load. It's the same way, Corrie, with knowledge. Some knowledge is too heavy for children. When you are older and stronger, you can bear it. For now, you must trust me to carry it for you. And I was satisfied, more than satisfied, wonderfully at peace. There were answers to this and all my hard questions. For now, I was content to leave them in my Father's keeping. Man,
I'm not to think about the garden.
Yeah, the garden. Yeah. Paul writing about Jesus not considering his equality with God something he could grasp. Um, yeah, it's amazingly open. Like, why do we have words and stories? We just love them.
It's her satisfaction in the Father,
right?
In that picture, and
her seeing it in her own Father. As we long for our real Father, our Heavenly Father. Evenings at the Bayet, there was always company and music. Guests would bring their flutes or violins, and as each member of the family sang or played an instrument, we made quite an orchestra gathered around the upright piano in Tante Ann's front room. You pick up?
Sure. Sure was nice of Tante Ann's to share her level of the house with everybody.
Yeah. Her having the most of it. Yeah.
I think about the commercial for the insurance, isn't it? But they say, we have a problem. We have ants in the house.
yeah.
So I thought about all these ants. The only evenings when we did not make our own music was when there was a concert in town. We could not afford tickets, but there was a stage door at the side of the concert hall through which sounds came clearly. There in the alley, outside this door, we and scores of other Harlem music lovers followed every note. Mama and Betsy were not strong enough to stand so many hours, but some of us in the Bayet would be there, in rain and snow and frost, and while from inside we would hear coughs and stirrings, there was never a rustle in the listeners at the door. Best of all was when there were concerts at the cathedral because a relative was sexton there. Just inside his small private entrance, a wooden bench ran along the wall. Here we sat, our backs chilled by the ancient stone, our ears and hearts warmed by the music. The great golden organ was one that Mozart had played, and some of its notes seemed to come from heaven itself. Indeed, I was sure that heaven was like St. Bavo's and probably about the same size. Hell, I knew, was a hot place, so heaven must be like this cold, dank, holy building where smoke rose like incense from the foot warmers of the paying customers. In heaven, I fervently believed everybody had foot warmers. Even in the summer, the chill never left the marble grave slabs on the floor. Grave slabs, yeah. But when the organist touched the keys, we scarcely noticed, and when he played Bach, not at all. What a gift. I was following Mama and Nolly up a dark, straight flight of stairs where cobwebs clutched at our hair and mice scuttled away ahead of us. The building was less than a block from the Bayet and probably a century newer. But here was no Tante Anna to wax and scrub. We were going to see one of the many poor families in the neighborhood who Mama had adopted. It never occurred to any of us children that we ourselves were poor. The poor were people you took baskets to. Mama was always cooking up nourishing broths and porridges for forgotten old men and pale young mothers, on days, that is, when she herself was strong enough to stand at the stove. The night before, a baby had died, and with a basket of her own fresh bread, Mama was making the prescribed call on the family. She toiled painfully up the railless stairs, stopping often for breath. At the top, a door opened into a single room that was obviously cooking, eating, and sleeping quarters all at once. There were already many visitors, most of them standing for lack of chairs. Mama went at once to the young mother, but I stood frozen on the threshold. Just to the right of the door, so still in the homemade crib, was the baby. It was strange that a society which hid the facts of sex from children made no effort to shield them from death. I stood staring at the tiny, unmoving form with my heart thudding strangely against my ribs. Nolly, always braver than I, stretched her hand and touched the ivory white cheek. I longed to do it too, but hung back, afraid. For a while, curiosity and terror struggled in me. At last, I put one finger on the small, curled hand. It was cold. Cold as we walked back to the Bayet, cold as I washed for supper, cold even in the snug, gaslit dining room. Between me and each familiar face around the table crept those small, icy fingers. For all Tante Ann's talk about it, death had only been a word. Now I knew that it could really happen, If to the baby, then to Mama, to Father, to Betsy. Still shivering with that cold, I followed Nolly up to our room and crept into bed beside her. At last we heard Father's footsteps winding up the stairs. It was the best moment in every day when he came up to tuck us in. We never fell asleep until he had arranged the blankets in his special way and laid his hand for a moment on each head. Then we tried not to move even a toe. But that night, as he stepped through the door, I burst into tears. I need you, I sobbed. You can't die. You can't. Beside me on the bed, Nolly sat up. We went to see Ms. Hoog, she explained. Corrie didn't eat her supper or anything. Father sat down on the edge of the narrow bed. Corrie, he began gently, when you and I go to Amsterdam, when do I give you your ticket? I sniffed a few times, considering this. Why, just before we get on the train. Exactly. And our wise Father in heaven knows when we're going to need things too. Don't run out ahead of him, Corrie. When the time comes that some of us will have to die, you will look into your heart and find the strength you need, just in time.
And that's the end of chapter 2. So we'll be back at it tomorrow night at 8, and we'll try to get through chapter 3 and 4 at that point. So
depends on how much we talk.
Yeah. We'll try and keep it to a minimum, but it's hard not to.
Yeah.
It's hard not to. So, thanks for joining. Hopefully this is it's part of bringing us together.
Yeah.
So we thank you.
Peace.